Dear learners, we welcome you to this MOOC on Sociology of Health and Illness. Today, in this lecture, we'll discuss Module 2, which is titled Basic Concepts. I will be discussing unit from this module titled Medicalisation, Demedicalisation and Illness Narratives. So, after going through this unit, you will be able to 1. Understand the basic concepts relating to sociology of health and illness. Point 2. Understand in detail the process of medicalization and demedicalization. And point 3. Analyze the concept of illness narratives. So let's start off with the concept of medicalization. Now what is medicalization? Medicalization refers to a process by which non-medical problems become defined and treated as medical problems, usually in terms of illness or disorders. According to Conrad is an American medical sociologist. He says medicalization is a term used to define the behaviors which were once taken as immoral, sinful or criminal as something which has a medical meaning, thus moving them from badness to sickness. In other words, medicalization consists of defining a problem in medical terms, using medical language to describe a problem, adopting a medical framework to understand the problem, or using a medical intervention to treat the problem. So medicalization is also associated with social control. American sociologist Jesse Pitts in 1968 argued that redefining certain aspects of deviance as illness rather than crime is one means whereby deviant behavior is controlled. So medicine started to replace religion and law as a major institution for social control. Now let us go on to some of the examples of medicalizations. It includes conditions such as alcoholism, eating disorders, sexual dysfunction, learning disabilities, balding, aging, and so on. Along with these, it has also included categories such as attention deficit hyperactive disorder, which is called ADHD, premenstrual syndromes, PMS, and so on. Now, we will go on to discuss the genesis and rise of medicalization. So, the ideas behind the concept of medicalization have their beginnings with the writings of Michael Foucault and Ivan Illich. The title entered academic and medical publications in the 1970s. Factors that have encouraged medicalization include an abiding faith in science, rationality, increased prestige and power of the medical profession, and a general humanitarian trend in the Western societies. So, prior to the 1970s, what happened was the common maladies which we now know as attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD, obesity, alcoholism, premenstrual syndrome called PMS, they were not viewed in the medical profession as a disease. This was prior to 1970s. Now, what happened after post-1970s to the present was that medical professions have identified several problems that have become commonly known as illness or disorders. Many of the earliest studies assumed that physicians were the key to understanding medicalization. Illich, in 1976, he used the catchy but misleading phrase called medical imperialism. However, this statement was contested because medicalization is a form of collective action. Social movements, patient organization, and individual patients have also been important advocates for medicalization. For instance, if I give you an example, in cases like alcoholism, medicalization was primarily accomplished by a social movement. The movement was called Alcoholics Anonymous, and physicians were actually late adopters of the view of alcoholism as a disease. Now, in recent years, corporate entities like the pharmaceutical industry and potential patients as consumer have begun to play more significant roles in medicalization. The impact of medicine and medical concepts have expanded enormously in the past 50 years. Simultaneously, the number of physicians per population nearly has doubled in that period, greatly extending medical capacity. So now let's come on to the next subheadings titled Degrees of Medicalization. Now, when we discuss medicalizations, we need to keep in mind that medicalization need not be total. Thus, we can say that there are degrees of medicalization. Some conditions such as death, childbirth, and severe mental illness are almost fully medicalized. Others, such as opiate addiction and menopause, are partly medicalized. And the third category, sexual addiction, spouse abuse, and other such illness and problems are the ones which are minimally medicalized. Now, medical categories can shift on the continuum towards or away from more complete medicalization according to the problem faced by the patient. Availability and profitability of treatments, coverage by medical insurance, and the presence of individuals or groups who promote or challenge medical definition may all be significant in particular cases of determining the degrees of medicalization. Now let us go on to discuss regarding the commercialization of medicine. So in the neoliberal era, what happened was medical products, services or treatments are promoted to consumers to improve their health, appearance or well-being. Thus, we see the development of medical markets. For instance, if we talk about cosmetic surgery, it has a huge market demand due to the demand of the consumers. The constant development of new technologies, treatments, and drugs and advertising can further increase the consumer demands in the medical market. Likewise, the manufacturing of Paxil, Prozac to treat depression and anxiety related disorders have also contributed to the medicalization of emotions such as worry and shyness. While drug marketing is not the sole factor in the medicalization of shyness, it is a key example of how pharmaceutical marketing can reframe and medicalize common human characteristics and experiences. Marketing any kind of disease and then selling drugs to treat those diseases is now common in what is known as the post-Prozac era. So now we have discussed about demedicalization. Now we come to the concept of demedicalization. Medicalization as a concept is bidirectional in the sense that there can be both medicalization as well as demedicalization. Now, what is demedicalization? So, for demedicalization to occur, the problem must no longer be defined in medical terms, and medical treatments can no longer be deemed as appropriate interventions. There are only a few documented examples of almost complete demedicalization. A classic example is masturbation, which in the 19th century was considered a disease and worthy of medical intervention. Later, studies claimed that 90% of men masturbated. The practice became statistically normal, and when it became statistically normal, this practice was declared as healthy. Another example is homosexuality, which was officially demedicalized in the 1970s. Now we come on to the next subtopic, which is called medicalization, a boon or a bane. So basically, we'll be discussing the positives and the negatives of medicalization. Now let's move on to the positives. Positive point number 1. Recognizing a condition as a disease, certain conditions can be treated that affect the quality of life. So in other way, when the disease get treated that was affecting a person's quality of life, it also improves the person's self-esteem. Now we move on to the negatives. So virtually, now with the concept of medicalization, any human difference is susceptible to being considered a form of pathology, a diagnosable disorder, and subject to medical intervention. For instance, medicalization is turning shortness, breast size, and male baldness into problems that are subject to medical enhancements. In future, there may be processes like genetic interventions. It may be used to design babies free from characteristics that we now deem as pathological. For example, low academic intelligence, shortness, etc. can be cured with the help of genetic interventions which may happen in the future. Second point of the negatives include medical definitions of normalcy. So what does it mean? Medical designations are increasingly defining for us what is normal, what is expected and acceptable in our life. Medical interventions have transformed our view of normal aging and what constitutes routine clinical care. For example, the expectation of sexual performance have grown, especially among older men with the introduction of Viagra. Another example can be the anti-aging industry, which is growing because of the demands of the consumers. Now you have different treatments to look young, to look and feel young. So oldness is also considered as a pathological condition. Increasing medical control over bodies is the third point. So with the increase in medical surveillance, an increasing number of individuals have become the objects of medical interest, even though they may not be currently ill. For instance, the increasing use of gastric bypass operations for obesity, the rising number of breast and other forms of cosmetic surgery are medical interventions that reshape bodies to make them more socially acceptable. Now we move on to the fourth point, a narrow focus on individuals rather than the social context. The clinical gaze focuses more on the individual rather than the social context. The general mode is to solve the problem in the individual, not the society. So medicalization treats the individual with alcoholism or the disruptive child with ADHD rather than intervening in the environment that produces alcohol abuse or the school system that deems the child troublesome or troubled. Now we have gone through the concepts of medicalization and demedicalization. Now we'll move on to the next concept, which is called illness narratives. So what is illness narrative? In medical anthropology, scholars often use illness narratives to explore how individuals embody the memory of an illness experience. This is in contrast to traditional medical case histories that present patients' illness as generalized diseases with a focus on the symptoms and pathological processes. These narratives focus on the patient's subjective experience and understanding of the illness, and they can highlight the social and cultural factors that may have influenced the symptoms. Illness narratives consists of a dual process of understanding. One is exploration of the chronic illness helps in understanding the nature of disrupted experience, its meanings and actions to deal with the particular illness or disease. Number 2, narratives also help in revealing important issues relating to identities, experiences, and late modern cultures. what promoted to the rise in illness narratives? Illness narratives were given importance particularly with the rise of doctor-patient relationship in early modern times. However, illness narratives as a practice declined with the rise of scientific biomedicine. The need to attend to the patient was reduced to taking information about the signs and symptoms of the disease, the patient's social environment, and the conditions in which he or she lives in is not considered. Thus, illness was separated from everyday life by professional medicine and the patient's suffering was silenced. However, over time with the growth in chronic illness, layman narratives came back into focus. Now, what are the dynamics of illness narratives? Illness narratives are performed by patients who are characters in their ongoing stories, actors constantly influenced by their social environments. It provides insights into a patient's society, especially about the following aspects. Number 1, how group experience molds individual experiences. Social trauma are sometimes commemorated in the lived experience of individuals. For examples, people who come back from the war, if I give an example, are sometimes socially traumatized by the scenes they have seen while they were in the war arena. So these experiences sometimes come to haunt their experiences in the present. So these group experiences show how it molds individual experiences. Second point, how cultural values and social relations shape the body's illness experience. So biomedical condition can occur due to psychological trauma as well. For instance, if an individual faces a huge trauma or loss in their life, it may be manifested in the later experiences, and some biomedical conditions may appear in the patient's body or patient's day-to-day life, which needs the illness narratives to understand what exactly happened to the patient. Number 3, how societal influences may trigger the body's memory of an illness. So memories of a patient's past illness are sometimes triggered by social pressures and affect their present day recovery. If we talk about the case of a patient suffering from anorexia nervosa, where the patient do not eat in the fear of becoming fat. So what happens is that sometimes the social pressures, societal pressures to maintain a thinner body can also affect the patient, and then they can go back to the habits which they followed during their disease of anorexia nervosa, and it can affect their present day recovery. Fourth point is how the society helped create illness. Now, illness narratives in merging individual and group experiences in a therapeutic process that gives meaning to the individual sufferer's life is also important. One example from this can be the de-addiction centers. Here, we all know how de-addiction centers work. The people, they will come to a group, and they will talk about their experiences and the bad effects they have faced due to alcohol addiction or any other type of addiction. So these all can manifest in a type of illness to be detected, and that can be cured systematically with the help of medicine. To sum up, illness narratives provides a more holistic understanding of a patient condition. It shows how collective societal experiences mold individual experiences and how suffering is tied to a larger social trigger. It contributes to the understanding of individual experience by showcasing social relations and cultural values. These narratives do not just depend on pathological description. It also goes on to see what kind of social environment the patient lives in and what else are the ways in which have triggered the illness in the person. So for now, we will discuss what we have discussed throughout the lecture. We have started off with the concepts of medicalization and demedicalization. Then within the concepts, we moved on to the genesis of medicalization. After that, we talked in detail about the commercialization of medicine. Then we moved on to the positives and negatives of medicalization. After discussing the concepts of medicalization and demedicalization, we went on to discuss the concept of illness narrative. Then we talked about its genesis and rise in the society. Afterwards, we moved on to the importance of illness narratives in the doctor-patient relationship. So this is all we have to discuss for this lecture today. Thank you so much.